Hi everyone. Hello, welcome to the panel on media that cover other media. Ready? So we have a very exciting and, dare I say it, distinguished panel representing some of the most interesting and influential sites and programs that cover the media as a topic. They cover the practice and business, ethics, power dynamics of journalism in various different ways. And today we're going to have a session lasting till 4. No, till 5? 4? What time is it? 4. 5. Where are we? Delving into some of what makes that kind of journalism interesting and special, what function it plays in the field of journalism, and also what sort of things might be happening that are interesting and diverse and different within it, what might be missing from it, what it could be doing more. So we're going to be talking with 3, like I say, very, very interesting, they're go-to sort of people for me in the field. So we've got Catalina Albiano from journalism.co.uk, and then Lyra McKee, who is one of the 3 editors at Media Gazer. Media Gazer is a sort of a site that offers a list of the most important stories and links in the media industry, mainly focused on the US, Europe, but often quite global, stories on press freedom and things like that. And then Marcela Pizarro, who is with Al Jazeera's Listening Post, both behind and on camera, right? So just as a way of introduction, I think, for me, the reason I kind of put this panel together was really because I was reading, I don't know, many of you may have read that Evgeny Morozov piece about technology and journalism, sort of people covering technology in various different ways, and some people are doing it well and interestingly and investigating, big questions, and then others were not. And so I wanted to bring together some of the people who were investigating big questions of various kinds and who I think are doing interesting work to talk about how they do it and what they do and why, and what they think about the sort of nature of covering the media. So that's what we have. And so I wanted them to start off really by talking about what you do, what your day-to-day work is, and what the sort of mission and concept behind your work is, and how you work. Do you want to start, Catalina?
Hello, I'm the international editor at journalism.co.uk. We're a UK-based website that acts as a resource for journalists. So we've got, on the editorial side, we cover how technology is changing journalism, the new tools that journalists have available to them. So we're doing this through case studies. So we would do articles about certain projects or experiments going on in different newsrooms, how they're being created, why they're being done, what's worked well, what hasn't. So for the editorial side, we're very much focused on practical digital journalism transformation, and we are writing basically about journalists for journalists. So our audience is practicing journalists, a mixture of freelancers, editors from lots of different newsrooms, and increasingly more international newsrooms as well. Aside from the editorial that we have going on the website, we also offer training for journalists. We run events, so experience sharing events, which happen in London a couple of times a year. We also have a jobs board, so we do lots of different things that could be helpful to journalists. So we like to think of the website as a bit of a hub, so people can come to us and see what are some of the new things happening in digital journalism, and then find out where they can find out more about it. So journalism.co.uk started in 1999, so a very long time ago, and it was slightly different because it was focused more on standard media news. And over the years, it started being focused more on digital, and that's exclusively what we do right now. We would cover some stories that are not necessarily just digital transformation, but our primary focus is on technology and how it's shaping the media. We've noticed over the last couple of years that we're starting to get more people coming to our events in London from lots of different countries. So in December, I started what I like to call a mobile bureau. So for a couple of months up until this point, and for another 2 months from now, I've been working remotely from different cities across Europe, doing my job remotely, but also setting up some meetings with media outlets and journalists that we would normally interview over Skype or on the phone or just email, because I felt it was really important just to get to know people face to face and see why they come to our website, why they come to our events, and how we could better serve them and potentially better collaborate with them, because for a long time we've been focused on primarily English language media, and we still do that because it's hard for us to be able to find out what's happening in all of these countries where we don't speak the language. They might not be blogging all the time about what they're doing. So I'm basically trying just to find out a bit more about the people who read us. And I've been to Belgium and France so far, and I'm going to different cities in Scandinavia in May. And I've been doing some stories from what I found, but the project is not complete yet, so we'll see how it goes.
Okay, thanks. Lara, tell us about Media Gazer.
All right. Hi, folks. I'm Lara McKay. I'm from Belfast in Northern Ireland. As Samir said, I'm representing Media Gazer, which is a San Francisco-based media news aggregator. Now, I don't really like that word, aggregator, because when you hear the word aggregator, you might think immediately that we're copying stories or rewriting them and trafficking off other people's work. But I think the best description I ever heard of Media Gazer was someone described us as a friendly aggregator. And what that means is when you hit our site, what you will see is our series of headlines. And these are the stories that are dominating the discourse among journalists that day, or that we feel are important and are trying to surface for our audience. And you'll see the headline and you'll get a couple of sentences. But if you want to read that story, you actually have to click on it. And so journalists like to get on our site because it sends them a wee bit of traffic. We also have a sister site called Tech Meme, which covers tech news, a site called Memorandum, which covers politics, US politics mostly, and then we have a site called WeSmart, which covers celebrity news. But obviously today I'm here to talk about Media Gazer, which is the site that I work on. For me, I think the one thing that we try to do with Media Gazer is it's almost like to me it's like a water cooler, a digital water cooler. I'm finding journalists are increasingly working from remote locations, working remotely. As Catalina said, I know with our own team, we are spread across the world to cover the time zone, 24-hour news cycle. So we have editors in Australia on some of the sites, we have editors in India, have editors in Northern Ireland, all over. And really, so from that perspective, I think for me, the greatest use that Media Gazer has is that you learn what people are talking about. You learn what's going on, because we also will cluster, what we call cluster, put up the conversations that are happening around stories from Twitter. So, for example, if what Jeff Jarvis is saying about a story, what other people, prominent people within the media are saying about a particular story or a particular innovation. So you'll get to see what all these people are saying. These people that maybe if you live outside sort of normal media bubble, places like New York, for example, or London, that maybe these conversations that maybe you wouldn't be privy to because you're not physically there, but you can see them happening online. So as I said, we try to cover everything. Well, basically we try to cover broadly digital content and where is the industry going, and mixed in with that journalism and the issues that are facing journalism going forward. So you'll find stories about press freedom. Increasingly I find that we're covering stories about a certain person living in a certain White House, which hadn't happened before, or well, it happened occasionally but not that often. But we're finding now that the days that I'm busiest are the days that Donald Trump sends a bunch of tweets about the New York Times. It's not actually becoming as newsworthy anymore. He needs to drum up some new insults, failing New York Times. Heard it so many times before from him. So we So as I said, that's what we do. There are 3 of us. One of us is based in New York. There's myself, and there's another who is based in North Carolina. And then we have, as I said, we have other editors who will jump in and say, because there's maybe a couple of hours during the night when all of us are sleeping, and so one of the other editors from TechMeme will jump in if something breaks, which is usually about 4 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock US, and so normally that doesn't happen because we're covering, trade news really, so it's only on the off chance that something happens, like some prominent figure dies, that you have these backup editors that we work with. We make money from advertising, from ads placed on the site. We also have job listings on the site, which of different roles that are going, which I think is great to see, because I'm sure when I came into this industry, it was absolute hysteria. And what we kept hearing was, journalism is dying, and there was real fear in the air. But now, you look at our site and you see all the jobs that are going at these, journalism startups, at places like Vox, BuzzFeed, and it's good. It's good for the soul, I think. It's good to see. So I said, that pretty much sums up Media Gazer and what we do. We're at MediaGazer.com. And one other thing I would say is we actually rewrite headlines, because sometimes, you get those headlines that say you'll never guess what Rupert Murdoch did next, or something like that, and we rewrite the headline to be very specific, to say Rupert Murdoch did X and then Y happened. And the idea behind that is that we're trying to be useful for our readers. We don't want or sometimes we'll find that there's a big lead in a story and it's buried 6 paragraphs down. So we will rewrite the headline to highlight what that lead is that has been missed, So yes, that sums us up.
Marcella from Listening Post, very different, obviously being television. So.
Exactly. Thank you for having me here. I work for the media critique show on Al Jazeera English, which the channel was launched 10 years ago. The program I work on is dedicated solely to the media, the culture of media, the politics of representation on the media, the economics and the politics behind those kinds of structures. We dissect the narratives, we explore, we chart the modes of production of media. We are TV. We're based in London, but I'd say that we have very much a... Is this uncomfortable, this near to the microphone? Is it okay? We're based in London. We're an English-speaking outlet, broadcast, but we are decentered in our gaze. Our coverage covers coverage around the world. Our team is a mixture of Kosovans, Italians, Canadians, Chileans, Indians, Iranians, Dutch people, sometimes Mexicans, sometimes French people, sometimes Polish people. So that decenters the gaze of a show that attempts to have a very critical sensibility to what's being produced around the world in terms of news. Our interests are eclectic. So our show is a weekly magazine show. It lasts 30 minutes. And in those 30 minutes, we try and cover a hell of a lot of stuff in different kinds of ways. So the beginning of our show leads with the main news of the week, but the media angle to it. So it's last week, we did the production of terrorist narratives coming off the back of the Westminster attack. The religious discourses, the stereotyping that goes on, the formats and the formulaic kinds of templates that journalism tends to fall back on for different reasons, not just ideological, but because TV especially is at the mercy of 24-hour news, what the problems are with that. We also deal with the culture of journalism in many different ways, from the story of technology, from the story of the digital revolution, to global stories on language. The most recent one was a Peruvian national news channel that is broadcasting solely in Quechua for the second time in its history, in a country where at least 4 million people speak Quechua as their first language. So we're used to not being able to understand the news since their own TV history started. We have stories on media concentration, the politics behind how stories are being told and why. Last week we did something on Romania. The predominance of oligarchs in the media landscape buying up that space and entering into serious conflicts of interest stories. And I think that really what we're trying to look at, we're trying to unravel every single element of the production of news, not just in terms of the story, but in terms of all the visual devices that are being used, in terms of graphics, fonts, the images, how they're edited, the history of the devices being used. So we have this is a discourse analysis show too. We like to chart and we like to pick up on every single convention that could potentially have a way of reconstructing what we've been told is reality. So one of the premises of our show is that unmediated reality is a myth, and that everything is constructed via different forms of languages, be they visual or textual, audio, the things that go across the screens, the music that's played at the beginning of a news bulletin, the mastheads, the history of the fonts being used in newspapers, etc., etc. And there's once, and I'll end on this one because I thought it was beautiful, I interviewed a graphic designer once on the history of fonts and the politics of those fonts, and we got to a stage when we were talking about the globalization of fonts and the fact that Latin script had become so standardized that they were infringing on fonts in other languages, and that those languages therefore were losing their memories. And he said fonts too have memories, and that plays out in the way that people receive their information and how information is becoming, in the context of globalization, standardized itself. So there's a politics to everything, even to Comic Sans, when you're deciding to use it.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. We got to Comic Sans quite quickly there. That's good. I think, there are three kind of main areas that I feel like you've all touched on in one way or another. One is that diversity of voices and perspectives and styles in the media that you're all sort of looking to. You're trying to kind of push people to a wider array of sources, a wider array of types of discussion, broaden things out, or get them to look at things much more closely, not in such a superficial way. There's also, you all seem to be looking at different aspects of power in one way or another. You very, very explicitly, Marcella, and Lara, you in it, because of the direction of the discussions. And then you're looking at, one of the most interesting things is, I think, because you're looking so much at the interaction between technology and journalism, there's a power constantly being negotiated. All around us there are 750 panels on bots. And, there's a lot of, there's a heavy presence of tech companies and so on. So that the field, that dimension of the field of journalism seems to be something that you're sort of interrogating quite a lot. And then the last area that I think is sort of interesting and maybe more uncomfortable to talk about is what sort of you were talking about, Lyra, in terms of fear and fragility. That, there is this constant sense of worrying and people reading about, people obsessively reading about the media to find out what's going on, what should they be doing, who's doing it better, that sort of industrial angst that sort of happens constantly. So I think I was wondering if, one, if you feel that roughly reflects areas that you feel that's right, and also, where you would go with that. Talking about the diversity of voices issue within the media field and writing about the media field, you're all writing in English language, or you're doing stuff about the English language, in the English language for dissemination in the English language particularly. But you're trying to diversify within that. So how are you finding that part of your work? The diversity of voices, trying to, you're going to Europe and trying to talk to lots of different kinds of people. So how's that influencing what you want to do?
It's a tricky one because on the editorial team at journalism.co.uk, we are 3 people, including me. And we do all of the writing on the website, as well as helping to organize the conference. So we also manage the agenda. So we have very long to-do lists. And we do try to find new stories instead of going to the same people all the time and going to the same organizations all the time. We do try to kind of cast a wide net and see what we can find. But I think it's something that goes both ways, because we monitor all of these other websites that write about the media, and we know what they're doing and what they're writing about and which countries they're tackling and all of that, but we are limited by language. One of the big sources that we have for stories is the companies themselves, the teams themselves, when they produce something new, if they tweet about it, if they write about it, where we can find it, even if it's in a different language, or if it's a language that nobody in the team speaks. I feel that it would be useful to have more of that, and to have media organizations be more open about what they're doing. And we're lucky in a way as well, because we write about editorial. We very rarely talk about the financial side and the commercial and revenue streams. So for us, people are more open when we do interviews, and we ask them what's gone wrong, what do you wish had been different, what challenges you had, because we don't go into the numbers. Usually we ask about the numbers and they never give them. But in terms of just circling back to the diversity of voices, it's one thing that helps us and might help you if you're looking to find out what's going on in different organizations are the international organizations like the Global Investigative Journalism Network, or different NGOs or non-profits who have people on the ground in different countries who then circulate information from between those countries to each other.
I think the answer here is twofold. The answer, and in terms, if we're talking about diversity of voices from an organisational level, the big problem we have is too often the story of media is the story of white men. And that's because the barriers for working class kids and for people of colour to get into the media are far too high. Part of that has been economic, because newspapers and magazines are expecting these kids to work for free, which they can't do. I'm from a working class background myself, was raised in a single parent family. I know what it's like. You can't do it. You can't take 6 months out to go live in the most expensive city in the world to try and get your foot in the door. And I would say that any magazine, I understand that smaller magazines have to do it, but any magazine or newspaper that can afford to pay the going rate for an internship to bring these kids in and doesn't do it is quite frankly engaging in, well, they're part of the problem. They're absolutely part of the problem. In terms of diversity of voices, if we're talking about media coverage and how we try to keep voices diverse in Media Gazer, the big problem that I face is that, we talk about how there's no gatekeepers anymore in the media, because everyone can blog now. But the big problem is distribution. So how do I find this brilliant writer who writes on a tiny unknown blog? Because it takes a critical mass for that person to reach me and for what they're writing to reach me. And it's really hard for me, especially in a real-time breaking news environment. It's really hard for me to find these voices and to take the time to find them, and to find these takes on, say, the latest news. As I said, it really takes for these voices to break through my filter bubble. But equally, I have to try and figure out how do I step out of my filter bubble to find them, so that I'm getting these voices on the site. So we're bringing them on. And this comes back to the problem of that so many people working in the media are white, middle class, and there's a lack of diversity there, which is then too often reflected, I think, because I'm finding it hard to find these voices that I really want to elevate. So again, how do you keep a diverse range of voices? Honestly, I'm still figuring that out. We're really trying to figure that out. Always looking out for new writers, people that we can, give a lift up to if they're doing good stuff. Again,
how do people reach you? I mean, do you get things? I mean, I know you accept tips and things like that,
Yeah.
but then what happens there? What sort of things? Are you getting?
We generally speaking, we read everything that comes into us, as long as it's relevant. That's a big issue I find. Is a lot of time we get stuff that really isn't relevant. But if you want to reach me, it's lyra@mediagazer.com. I'm at Lyra McKee on Twitter. You know, I can be found, and as I said, I'm looking out for these good writers writing stuff on media, so to make sure that we have a good, diverse range of people. You know, I'm very aware of my own privilege as a white person, and I want to be able to elevate as many non-white writers from LGBTQ backgrounds as we can. If, you know, as I said, if you're doing good stuff, then there's no reason we shouldn't have them on the site. But as I keep going back to this point, it's trying to get out of that filter bubble. Because for me to find these people, I need to know that they are out there. And I don't know how do I not know if they're out there? The only reason I tend to know if they're out there is if there's a critical mass of other people talking about them. That's, I think, big part of the problem for a lot of young journalists, especially those who are starting blogs, magazines, whatever. It's trying to stay the course long enough to break through that filter bubble, and that is really difficult if you're not from a privileged background, if you're not from money, if you don't have parents footing the bill, so to speak.
Okay.
So I'll probably just add another layer onto what you're saying, which is very, very important. I work for Al Jazeera English, which I think, for me at least, the way I interpret the principle of that channel is it's a global production of news that aims to intervene in the international market of northern news production. That means something that has to do with diversity, in as much as historically the representation of the other has always been done from the north to the south. So the production of news narratives on international affairs has tended to be done by those who come from the cosmopolitan centres of news production. So therefore, I would say that Al Jazeera English represents an attempt to break that logic and to bring in voices from the global south, we like to call it, journalists who are from those countries and who understand those countries from their own personal experiences. They've studied, sometimes in the north, sometimes in the south. They speak the language, they understand their own cultural histories. So in terms of diversity, I would say that this channel represents this attempt to multiply voices in a democratic way. Also, what I'd say about diversity on the show that I do is it's one of the most important things that we're constantly aware of in the way that we produce opinions. So we are very aware of avoiding at all costs going to the most easiest centres of knowledge production, which tend to be in the cosmopolitan north, because they've historically had that that privilege, which is also part of a colonial history. It's a long conversation. So if we are dealing with a story on Argentinian media, we will talk to Argentinians. We don't need to stay in London. We can go to Argentina. We talk to Argentinians talking about their own countries. If they don't speak English, we don't care. In fact, we ask them to speak in their own languages. So the device we use is a simple one. We voice over. Very eloquent people will voice them over in English. So we are using knowledge production, and we make it easy for them because they can express themselves in much easier ways. And the problem is often that the market tends to veer towards people who can speak English. We try and go past that hurdle by just telling them to speak in their own languages. We always ask women to speak louder, speak up much louder. Not because everything's about gender in terms of the stories, but because 50% of the population are women. Therefore, they need to produce critical narratives on their own media. And of course, in terms of gender, race, ethnicities, we have to always be aware that the people speaking about these stories have to be they themselves part of those stories. It's very important for us. So it's a very interesting and important question for us, diversity.
I wanted to take a minute to see if there are questions from the audience at this point, because I realize, we've got about 20 minutes left, and I didn't want to kind of run to the end and not have that opportunity. Are there any?
Thank you. I have a question for Lyra. I work in a sort of a similar web portal that's an aggregator of things on culture. And we have a sort of a search engine through databases and a news aggregator. And we have our internal motto being culture beyond Google and also culture beyond Facebook newsfeed. And we sort of take this as our political statement as well as an operational motto. But at the same time, we feel bound to use Facebook for distribution, which sort of gives a sour feeling when doing this. And how do you treat Facebook as an alternative and in a way dominant, politically possibly sort of on the other side station thing? How do you treat this as an organization?
Can I just clarify, you're asking me how we use Facebook for distribution?
Yeah, considering you probably have a political stance in what you're doing.
Well, firstly, I would say that we don't have a political stance in what we're doing. We're not aligned to any party or anything like that. Our entire team is from a very diverse many different walks of life. In terms of how we use Facebook for distribution, TechMeme would use Facebook. That's our tech news site, our sister site. They would use Facebook for distribution. They've only started trialing that in the last 2 years. But I think Twitter is a much bigger distribution vehicle for MediaGazer personally. The reason being that Twitter is the other water cooler for journalists. It's their second home. It's where they connect online, and so we would find that we don't have a Facebook page, but we have a Twitter page, and we have nearly 51,000 followers on it, and that would really be the big distribution vehicle for us. In terms of Facebook, I mean, I find Facebook. I'm not a marketer. No, my job is editing, so I don't look after the social channels. Our founder, Gabe Rivera, would look after those. I find Facebook an interesting one from the perspective of the whole fake news debate, which we've been covering in depth lately. I know I'm going off a wee bit here. I'm watching Facebook with a lot of interest just because, I mean, the minute Facebook is going on a tour of the States, they've been on the tour of States where they're listening to journalists and asking them for feedback. But I'm very curious about, I said, regarding the fake news debate and things like that. I think Facebook's definitely one to watch. As I said, I couldn't say too much about the distribution because we've used Twitter for distribution. In terms of how Twitter has worked out for us for distribution, it's funny. Sometimes you can't predict what story is going to go viral, but I usually have a sense of which one is going to be retweeted a couple of hundred times. And it tends to be stories that sort of have an emotional tangent to them. I find that if we do a Trump and media story, that usually picks up a couple of hundred retweets. But there seems to be, if a story hits on emotion, so not something covering innovation, but say something covering the death of a journalist or a particularly emotive issue, we find that then Twitter, there's a lot of pickup there, and we'll be able to see the conversations that are going on Twitter and what's happening, and what is actually happening there. I do feel that our audience is much more on Twitter than they are on Facebook. So I'm sorry that I can't really answer your question very well, just because I said we don't use it except for TechMeme,
okay.
And the tech audience would be much more inclined to that.
Well, I think what that prompts me to think. I can see Ross Settles at the back. I'm going to pick him out. You don't have to comment if you don't want to. But Ross works for Media Development Investment Fund and works a lot in Asia. And we've had conversations about, for example, the divide between the English language coverage of sort of journalism, media, power, innovation, those sorts of things, and then things that are happening in absolutely colossal markets that dwarf what's going on elsewhere. You know, things like WeChat and Tencent and these enormous companies that are, you know, among the 10 biggest companies in the world, but we never hear about, or very rarely get covered. So I was wondering, you know, when you look at that portion of the world where there is coverage, there are things being written about, but there's not a lot coming out from that region of the world. I don't know if you have something you want to chuck into the mix or you want to hang on, but up to you.
No, I'd be interested in the panel's response. But as somebody who kind of looks at the business, and I look at the business, I'm an investor, but looks at the business from the other side of the continent. The interesting thing is just the topics of conversation this week are so almost orthogonal to the topics of conversation that we would be having in Hong Kong or in Taipei or in Seoul. So it's very interesting how there is a small area of overlap and there is a huge area of kind of discontinuous conversations in whether they're in Chinese or Hindi or Telugu or whatever they are, and they're equally relevant to those huge populations, but they haven't even been scratched in the conversations this week.
What would those conversations be? I mean, if you want to pick out three things that are orthogonal, as you say, what would that be? And
again, remember that I come at it from a broader media, not just journalism perspective. So when I would say the soft power wars, although I do give great credit to the Listening Post, I'm a big fan. So of the media, of the reporting organizations up there, they do coverage of what CCTV is doing in Africa, or what NHK is doing with NHK World in Europe, or what RTV is doing in South America. So they do that coverage, but that would be one thing. It's a much more, the soft power wars are afoot in Asia. Media, entertainment, the role of entertainment media, Hollywood in China, China in Hollywood, Bollywood in both. That is an interesting story that it may not be appropriate for this week, but it is a big story. What else? Money. Who's investing in what? Nikkei buying the Financial Times. That will be the first of what I'm sure will be many. Well, HNA Group, which is basically an airline group, has made a bid, $400 million bid for Forbes. So those stories sometimes I feel like they've been lost in this week, but again, I come from a slightly different perspective.
Okay. Thank you.
We covered both those stories on Media Gazer, by the way, the Nikkei and the NHK. If I could quickly make a point, I see what you're talking. I do agree with what you're talking about. I know that the Hollywood and China story is becoming a big thing, and I know Hollywood Reporter is covering it a lot. One of the problems I see is that Neiman Lab is really good at covering these sort of innovations, and like South Africa. But one of the problems I do think is that we only tend to cover these stories when there's a press freedom angle, and we don't actually, there tends to be a tendency not to look beyond that, and I think there's maybe inherent assumptions made about these countries, and you know that I think a lot of reporters, media reporters, forget that there is a media here and that it goes beyond that story.
Because we don't do also much about the business side, so who is buying who, I'm going to talk a little bit about the social media aspect and technology. So whenever we write about WeChat or Viber or these technology platforms that are being used in different countries, it tends to be, unfortunately, through the lens of a UK organization who is using it. So we would probably write about the BBC World Service, who are doing their projects in different countries on different apps and why they're on that particular app, which is useful for us as well because it helps us understand a bit more about that environment there. We are not experts at media in Asia, so I wouldn't want to necessarily say that we would find out about that by ourselves. So because we work with the BBC occasionally and they know about us, they would email us and they would tell us that they're doing this thing. Whereas people and media organizations in Asia, they would not really email us unless we've spoken to them before and they know we exist. So that is the one problem that we face, is that while we would love to be able to cover these platforms and these media landscapes in much more depth, we don't necessarily have access to sources in those landscapes. And the other thing that I wanted to say was with conferences, the way that we find out about some of these international media outlets and we build contacts is at conferences like this one. So we are also limited by what's in the program there and who is able to come, and by the budget of everyone involved in that. So that's the reason why you will probably not see too much Asia or South Africa or South America stuff on journalism.co.uk. But that being said, we do sometimes touch on that. I wrote about Brazil last month, and we've written about South Africa before, so we will occasionally see those sorts of stories. It's just not 100% of the time.
I think that we kind of do that pretty well. Oh, do you want me to kill myself? Okay.
So, one of the questions I had for you is that what's missing in, I mean, you know, following on from that, what do you wish you could do more of? I mean, outside of, you know, what you've just said and finding more sources and being more diverse. If you were to, for example, if you were to design something from scratch, or you were to, you know, what's missing from the landscape, what needs to emerge right now that would complement or go beyond or challenge what you do?
Before I forget it. For very specifically for what we do at Al Jazeera, at the Listening Post, I think that what we should concentrate on more is the history of media, because to contextualize doesn't just mean to listen to the voices in the present of a story and to map out the different positions. It means to contextualize in terms of epochal shifts, not just in terms of the story of digital media, but the fall of the Berlin Wall is one of the key moments for media history in terms of the liberalization of the market, the notion that we're into liberal democracies and therefore that voices will be multiplied and journalism will be plural. You know, these are the myths and the foundations of those myths are extremely shaky because what happened, what came to pass was a liberalization of the market. And that didn't mean a difference of voices. It meant simply that there was more. For example. And so I would say that we need to push more for more historical stories in order to be able to understand how stories are being sold to us, and to be able to navigate and negotiate that information even more with much more sophistication.
I think there... do you know what? If we're talking about what's missing from media reporting, I would say one of the things I feel is missing is for coverage on the lack of trust in the media that we're currently seeing in the Western world. The fact that reporters didn't see this coming and that it really came as a surprise with the rise of Trump, I think should really concern them, because it shows that there was a lack of listening going on. And I think we need to have a look at that. I think they need to have a look at that and self-reflect on that. Also think there should be more coverage on on corporate relationships in the press, which is increasingly becoming a big thing. As you said, there's, you know, our line group has just bid 400 million for Forbes. You know, with the move towards conglomerates in the media, I think these ties are going to become even more. Looking at these relationships is going to become even more important, and reporting critically on the press is going to become even more important, and that is very difficult to do. I mean, we had it in the UK with News Corp and the coverage by The Guardian of the phone hacking scandal, and The Guardian really took a lot of flack over that. It was a very tense environment for them for quite a while. I would say it still is. So that would be the answer for me.
I think with trust, you're starting to see a little bit more coverage right now, but you are right that in general it hasn't really been on the agenda until it was already a huge problem and people started panicking about it. From my perspective, I would like to see more translation of media coverage from different countries in different areas of the world. And from a technology perspective, I think it would be helpful if we did a bit more reflection on the digital transformation and the things that people thought will be very big and very helpful and very exciting in the past and turned out not to be. because it could help in the future when some new things come up to have some practices or some ideas to fall back on of red flags or things that might not work out the way that they should.
Can you give an example of something you have in mind? Who doesn't love mini discs?
Well, there's a lot of different things. I've noticed one of the things that has changed a lot that in terms of how people approach these new platforms was that maybe a couple of years ago, organizations who had budget, they would go on everything, absolutely everything, just to see how it works and if it works for them, which is great. But right now, they're being, even the ones who are early adopters of most platforms, they're being much more cautious about where they're going.
Right.
So perhaps understanding what's happened there would be helpful for the future.
Going back to what you were just saying about trust, when we talked before the panel, you mentioned, Catalina, that you felt that in the coverage you've been doing, it started out where it was about the process of engagement, engaging audiences, and how news organizations were doing it, and it sort of shifted very, very rapidly into a discussion about the fundamentals of trust. So I wonder if you could unpick that a little bit.
We spent, and we still spend quite a lot of the time talking about engagement, because the conversation that media outlets have with people online is very debated, whether it should happen in the comments on social media, how it should happen, how people should interact. But more recently, it's shifted a bit more towards trust. Instead of wondering how you should engage with your audience, it's more about how to make them trust you. So that was one of the bigger shifts. And we see that media outlets are starting to be a bit more aware about the need to be a bit more transparent, to offer insights into how their organizations are operating. They usually do this mostly through membership schemes. So you'd have someone like The Guardian or the New York Times offering these articles or podcasts about how their newsroom operates to members. But recently, I think a couple of days ago, actually, Reuters announced that they were going to be doing a project called Backstory. So they're saying that under every article they post, they will put their guidelines for accuracy and transparency and all of that. And occasionally, some of these stories will have a backstory attached to it, which is going to be an explanation of how the story came about, a Q&A with the journalists. So I think the conversation is moving a lot more towards being transparent with your audience and you communicating back, as opposed to just having them talk and engage at you.
How long have we got?
5 minutes.
Okay, 1 minute. I think that this is a central dilemma. This issue of trust has a politics to it, obviously. There's a major crisis of trust in all institutions across the West, at least, and further. A crisis of credibility about papers of record, mainstream media, for various issues that we don't have time to go into. The problem being that if we're to read the economic realities that these kinds of outlets exist in, then you will quickly trace it to corporate ownership. So the economics of the media post-1990 inevitably means that there are conflicts of interest going on constantly. El País, which was the Spanish newspaper, which came out in 1976, represented the moment of democracy in Spain. Today, it's owned by Santander. There's certain things they're not going to publish, and that's applicable around the world in terms of establishment media, and that's a major problem.
I think before we jump to any last questions, I think from my perspective, when I look at things, I think one of the questions I have is around that I think possibly affects this trust issue, and I don't see covered as widely as you'd think, is that what Benjamin Walker called the honeypot, or somebody called the honeypot, is the sort of the media organizations being the sort of data use and the tracking of visitors to websites, and I think that drive to monetize alongside the sort of tracking and reselling of individuals' data is a sort of, personally, I think it's kind of an ethical time bomb that eventually is going to really blow up. But I don't see that. If I were to say what I think should be covered a bit more, I think that particular nexus is a real issue that doesn't get enough punching. Okay. Well, we've got 7 seconds for any questions. If you've got a really quick one. No. Okay, well, thank you very much for to all three. Thank you very much. It's really...
Resource for journalists. So we've got, on the editorial side, we cover how technology is changing journalism, the new tools that journalists have available to them. So we're doing this through case studies. So we would do articles about certain projects or experiments going on in different newsrooms, how they're being created, why they're being done, what's worked well, what hasn't. So for the editorial side, we're very much focused on practical digital journalism transformation. And we are writing basically about journalists for journalists. So our audience is practicing journalists, a mixture of freelancers, editors from lots of different newsrooms, and increasingly more international newsrooms as well. Aside from the editorial that we have going on the website, we also offer training for journalists. We run events, so experience sharing events, which happen in London a couple of times a year. We also have a jobs board, so we do lots of different things that could be helpful to journalists. So we like to think of the website as
person different within it, what might be missing from it, what what it could be doing more. So we're going to be talking with three, like I say, very, very interesting, they're go-to sort of people for me in the field. So we've got Catalina Albiano from journalism.co.uk. And then Lyra McKee, who is one of the three editors at Media Gazer. Media Gazer is a sort of a site that offers a list of the most important stories and links in the media industry, mainly focused on the US, Europe, but often quite global, stories on press freedom and things like that. And then Marcela Pizarro, who is with Al Jazeera's Listening Post, both behind and on camera, right? So just as a way of introduction, I think, for me... Hi, everyone. Hello, welcome to the panel on media that cover other media. Ready? So we have a very exciting and, dare I say it, distinguished panel representing some of the most interesting and influential sites and programs that cover the media as a topic. They cover the practice and business, ethics, power dynamics of journalism in various different ways. And today we're going to have a session lasting till 4. Till 5? 4? What time is it? 4. 5. Where are we? Delving into some of what makes that kind of journalism interesting and special, what function it plays in the field of journalism, and also what sort of things might be happening that are interesting and diverse. The reason I kind of put this panel together was really because I was reading, I don't know, many of you may have read that Evgeny Morozov piece about technology and journalism, sort of people covering technology in various different ways, and some people are doing it well and interestingly and investigating, big questions, and then others were not. And so I wanted to bring together some of the people who are investigating big questions of various kinds and who I think are doing interesting work to talk about how they do it and what they do and why and what they think about the sort of nature of covering the media. So that's what we have. And so I wanted them to start off really by talking about what you do, day-to-day work is and what the sort of mission and concept behind your work is and how you work. Do you want to start, Catalina?
Hello, I'm the international editor at journalism.co.uk. We're a UK-based website that acts as a bit of a hub, so people can come to us and see what are some of the new things happening in digital journalism, and then find out where they can find out more about it. So journalism.co.uk started in 1999, so a very long time ago, and it was slightly different because it was focused more on standard media news. And over the years, it started being focused more on digital, and that's exclusively what we do right now. We would cover some stories that are not necessarily just digital transformation, but our primary focus is on technology and how it's shaping the media. We've noticed over the last couple of years that we're starting to get more people coming to our events in London from lots of different countries. So in December, I started what I like to call a mobile bureau. So for a couple of months up until this point, and for another 2 months from now, I've been working remotely from different cities across Europe, doing my job remotely, but also setting up